Right. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Public Art Now, or if this is your first time with us, welcome to Public Art Now Conversations. My name is Dr. Gráinne Coughlin, I'm the coordinator of this event. And just for all of you to say thank you very much for joining us. Before we go into the conversation, I'm just going to run through the housekeeping rules again. So first of all, if you can all keep your microphones turned off, keep your Zoom view to speaker mode. If you'd like to ask questions during the event, please use the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your Zoom screens. And if you'd like to drop in a link or a resource or say hello to anyone, please use the chat function. So with that, we'll kick off into our next conversation, Public Art and Environment, Mapping, Sensing, Hacking, which will explore the notions of mapping, sensing and hacking as ways to engage with public space and as modes of governance in the Anthropocene. And this session is chaired by Dr. Glenn Loughran. Glenn Loughran is an artist and lecturer in fine art at the Dublin School of Creative Arts, Technological University, Dublin. He is the course coordinator of the BA in Visual Art on Sherkin Island and head of artistic research in the Graduate School of Creative Arts. He has printed internationally on artistic research, socially engaged art, pedagogy, and island studies. So over to you, Glenn.
Thank you, Gráinne. Hi, everybody. As Gráinne said, my name is Glenn Loughran, and I'm going to be the chair for this evening. And just to say that this, the focus, as Gráinne suggested, will be on environmental art and public space. And so to enable this discussion, I kind of proposed three concepts that are important to environmental discourse, which are mapping, sensing, and hacking. As political theorist David Chandler has suggested, these three concepts can be understood as three modes of governance or political thought that have emerged in response to a world that is, quote, complex, entangled, and unpredictable. That world, of course, as we know it, is the Anthropocene. While we will consider the kinds of political agency bound up in these modes of governance, we will also consider what types of artistic and pedagogical agency are caught up in these logics. Because as I'm sure you'll all know, mapping, sensing, and hacking are also three dominant artistic strategies that have developed over the latter half of the 20th century and into the 21st century. So to help us navigate these concepts, we've asked three of our panel members each to speak to one of the concepts that might be close to their current practice. Of course, each presenter could easily speak to any three of these concepts because the concepts themselves are kind of entangled. However, it seemed beneficial for the audience if we took a different position on each concept and in fact took a disciplinary position. So in many ways, what we're going to do is we're going to look at these concepts through the lens of education, curating, and artistic practice. So just before we start, I want to clarify a little bit on the format of the presentations. About 4 months ago, when we were preparing the conference, I got a little bit sort of nervous about the broadband gods and the kind of managing of the Wi-Fi connection that we might have to do. So I thought it would be safe to ask the presenters to send in a 12-minute PowerPoint presentation recorded. And whilst that has worked for one or two of the presenters, it hasn't worked for everybody. So the first presentation is going to be live. After that, there'll be a specific question from myself, and that will lead on to the next presentation, which will be recorded, which will also have a question, and then that will lead on to the final presentation, which will be recorded, and there'll be a question after that. And then there are three sort of questions designed around the relationship between public art and environmental art that we're going to use to kick off the discussion more generally. And then we'll put it out to the audience, and hopefully we'll get as much public feedback and interest as possible. So, okay, then to begin the session, we would like to sort of start by looking at this idea of mapping, and in particular, looking at mapping through the lens of gardening in the Anthropocene with Dr. Ross Gray. Ross is a senior lecturer in fine art, critical studies in the Department of in the art department at Goldsmiths, where she has led the development of the MA Art and Ecology program. Her research interests are increasingly focused on artistic interventions in the fields of soil care, cultivation, and decolonial ecologies more broadly. Ross also coordinates the Goldsmiths allotment, which provides a space for plant cultivation, meditation, and developing of thinking around forms of ecological care in the context of educational institutions. She is currently leading the planning of an art research garden at Goldsmiths and has convened the Chase series of lectures and workshops called What Can a Garden Be? I'm going to hand over to Ross. Delighted to have you here, and I'll come back to you after the session with a question. Over to you, Ross.
Thanks so much, Glenn. I that you're doing well and that the connection is strong, because it was cutting out for me a little bit just now.
All of a sudden, it has just got a little bit vulnerable there, Ross.
Okay. Now. Can you hear me okay?
I can just about hear you. It seems it literally has just gone from being a really strong connection to being a little bit wobbly. So I don't know if you want to take a minute and just check the broadband. There's no time pressure.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
I'm wondering if one of the other speakers should go first. Can you hear me?
Just about. It's very crackly. Do you want to? Okay, there you go. You're coming back in now. Okay.
Okay.
What I can
is that better?
What I might do is, oh, there you go. You're back in now. Try that.
Okay. Is that any better?
No, it's not, Ross. Unfortunately, what I might try to do is use your video, and hopefully the audio is a little bit weak on it, but what I'll do is I'll use the video, and then if you manage to sort out the broadband, we can come back in afterwards. Does that sound okay? So much for the broadband gods anyway. Okay, so I'll just play the recording that we have as a backup and see how we get on.
Hello, my name's Rose Gray and I'm the program leader of the MA Art and Ecology at Goldsmiths, and I'm a writer, researcher and gardener. I'd like to thank Glenn for inviting me and everyone involved in organising this conference. I'm going to speak to the theme of mapping the garden, and Glenn proposed that I speak to this theme of mapping in relation to my work on the coloniality of planting. The first thing I'd like to note is that techniques of mapping have long been tools of colonial capture and oppression. Techniques of mapping, such as the triangulation method of ordnance survey maps developed by William Roy, were invented as military strategy of English imperial conquest, particularly the mapping of the Scottish Highlands that followed the rebellion of 1745. But mapping is also a crucial method in making visible forms of what Rob Nixon calls slow violence, the ongoing effects of coloniality and the transformation of complex ecosystems into natural resources. So from that perspective, I'm interested in exploring how it might be possible to use mapping otherwise, both for this purpose of making visible, enduring forms of environmental violence, but also for the purpose of accessibility, of acknowledging alternative histories and ways of doing, of building connection and sharing. I'm going to start by saying a few words about my work on the coloniality of planting, much of it undertaken in collaboration with Sheller Shape. Included here are a number of publications that I've been involved with as an author, an editor, and a contributor over the last few years. The first of these was a special issue of Third Text entitled The Wretched Earth, Botanical Conflicts and the Politics of Planting. And this really grounded much of my work that followed. The title signals our engagement with anti-colonial thinkers such as Fanon, but also the need to embed decolonial understandings of the land more broadly in the more than human commons that is the web of life. Acknowledging the wretchedness of the earth as a pervasive condition and understanding its causes was a starting point for the research. But we were also collaborating with artists and researchers concerned with making interventions that would contribute to planetary health. The space of the garden was important to examine, not least for the fact that gardens in the Western imagination have often had utopian, Edenic associations, but are in fact riven with ambivalences that stem from questions concerning who is displaced in order to demarcate their boundaries, and whose labour is exploited to maintain them as sites of nourishment and enjoyment. The very word garden comes from the Anglo-Saxon word guard, meaning enclosure, a structure crucial to the privatisation of the commons, of displacement and segregation. The forerunners of the modern scientific botanical gardens, which were established in 16th century Italy, combined the scientific ideal of comprehending universal nature with religious motivations for recreating the Garden of Eden by gathering together all the creatures scattered at the fall of man. The inauguration of botany as a scientific discipline, which in time came to be based on Linnaeus' system for classifying and hierarchizing forms of life, took place as a consequence of the exploratory voyages of the European colonial project and the consolidation of the plantation system. Plants were extracted from their locality within ecosystems and bred into hybrids suited to plantation growing. It was a system of extraction and erasure of local forms of knowledge and the life worlds of which they were a part. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the botanical methods of categorizing and hierarchizing forms of life according to sexual difference and morphology came to shape pseudo-scientific justifications for imperialism and the construction of categories of race and sexuality. By and large, imperial science, what we might call a monoculture of knowledge, excluded other histories and systems of knowledge, ecologies of knowledge, as well as modes of being in the world that are not premised upon the value, profitability, and usefulness of plants that underpins the logic of capitalism towards nature. And those phrases, monoculture of knowledge and ecologies of knowledge, are used by Boaventura de Sousa Santos. Since the emergence of Black Lives Matter, there has been a lot more attention in the UK by activists and institutions such as Kew Gardens and the National Trust to how the vast wealth generated by slavery and the plantation system reshaped land ownership and the environment across the UK. Landscapes and nature are far from being passive backdrops, but in fact have agential capacities. They're not fixed, but are constantly changing and can be manipulated and even weaponized by human actors, from destroying the ecosystems in which people live to planting hedges, divide up land and bar access. We've inherited in the UK from the colonial plantation system a naturalization of who is to enjoy the land versus who is to work the land, and also who is supposed to advocate for the protection of the land. As we know, during the pandemic, the policing of lockdowns in the UK has disproportionately targeted people of colour, whose only access to green spaces might be their local park. In London, where I live and work, Metropolitan Police are twice as likely to fine Black people for breaching lockdown regulations, for example, gathering in public spaces and parks. Wild and green spaces are heavily racialized, and environmental racism is further evident in terms of exposure to air pollution and lack of access to gardens. So the garden is a site through which to trace and challenge exclusions along lines of race, class, gender, sexuality, and disability, as well as to reconsider environmental justice so that it is not seen in isolation from social justice. Part of what this involves is a refusal of the idea that nature can only be found in places where people are absent, and a shift towards a better understanding that human beings are part of ecological systems, be it rural or urban. I'm interested in examples of rewilding, not premised on ideas of past wilderness or organized around private property, but understood as a practice of shaping the future collectively and of rewilding ourselves as well as our surroundings. How might alternatives to the coloniality of planting be activated? How can diverse knowledges and cultivation practices be shared in non-appropriative ways? I want to explore some of these questions further by talking about some of the activities I've been involved with in recent years, as they have shaped my thinking every bit as much as my academic research. My experience with gardening in the space of the university began in 2015 when I was part of a group of students and staff who set up the Goldsmiths allotment. This is a space for anyone at Goldsmiths and the local area to get involved with planting and nurturing biodiversity. As well as gardening, it's a space for celebration, and it has hosted numerous workshops and exhibitions. We were determined to use non-toxic gardening methods, including not using pesticides or herbicides that are implicated in the decimation of insect populations and have risks to human health. So here are just some examples of some of the activities and workshops that have taken place at Goldsmiths allotments over the last few years, including art exhibitions, and this one is an exhibition called Companion Planting that was curated by Cristina Ramos and Sarah Rodriguez. So this experience on a micro scale led to a student staff campaign for a Green New Deal for Goldsmiths that has successfully campaigned for a much more ambitious set of environmental goals for the college, some of which related to how the grounds were maintained. And you can see some of the kind of key aims listed here. Over the last 2 years, the art department has begun planning an art research garden at Goldsmiths, and some of the kind of ideas and ambitions have been very much based on the experience of running the allotment. But the idea of the art research garden is that it will operate as a micro context from which to observe change in our natural environment and facilitate a range of artistic research into living systems, cultivation and processing of plants and foods, pigments, composting, and the therapeutic benefits of gardening, as well as a space for teaching and public engagement through workshops, performance, and other events. So we want the art research garden to support ecological, artistic research and teaching, knowledge transfer, and public engagement, including what we hope is that it will provide outdoor and indoor growing, cooking facilities, and teaching space, all with disabled access. Over this last year, the COVID pandemic has disrupted the development of the garden, but this pause has also provided an opportunity for reflection, debate, and looking to compelling examples about how gardens can support artistic research. Gardens understood in the sort of broader sense. To further this, I organised a series of online lectures and talks funded by the Chase Consortium called What Can a Garden Be? In these talks, we heard from artists, curators, activists, and researchers whose work is grounded in practices of sustainability, decoloniality, permaculture, queering nature, nurturing place-based knowledge, and building community and resilience in opposition to colonial imaginings. So the lectures provided a stimulus for PhD workshops addressing research methods, such as working with ephemeral infrastructures, decolonial strategy, challenging art science boundaries, knowledge sharing, mapping, and modern human collaboration. So the series was aiming to critically address the coloniality of the garden, but also explore how the garden might be designed and inhabited otherwise. And so I've been thinking a lot about Boaventura de Sousa Santos's phrase, ecologies of knowledge, and how different forms of knowledge might speak to one another and be made accessible. With this in mind, I've been collaborating with the South African Bristol-based artist Tracy Hennon to make animations of the talks that capture the proliferation and dialogue of ideas and aspirations across the talk series. And so to finish, I'd like to share with you a work in progress that's based on one of the research methods workshops that I ran. In part, I was briefing the research students about the idea of the art research garden, but they were also, and we were discussing some of the examples that we've been looking at through the talk series from the other speakers. But they were also sharing their responses in terms of their thinking about how their research projects, their artistic research projects, resonated with the art research garden. So I'm going to finish by playing a few minutes of this animation. It doesn't have a soundtrack, so I would like to invite you to immerse your eye in this mapping that seeks to capture a whole series of conversations, aspirations, and examples.
Okay, Ross, I think we might have you back, do we?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you fine, yeah. Can you hear us okay?
Yes, I can hear you really well.
Great, okay. I remember when I first saw that animation, I thought that this would be a really good experiment to just have the animation and then the discussion afterwards, because there was so much in it that prompted an awful lot of thinking that it'd be a nice device just to create a conversation.
Thank you, Glenn Loughran, for inviting me today. And thanks to the Dublin Technological University and Public Art Fund for hosting. Today, I want to talk about the role of sensing, affect, and feeling in art. One of the artistic projects in the upcoming.
Apologies for that. That's the video running on. I'll come back to that. Sorry, Ross, just was there anything that you felt you needed to clear up about that, the presentation or the video, just before I go into the question?
Well, I suppose just to say that it's a collaboration between me and an artist called Tracy Hennon, and it's very much experimenting with how to capture a set of ongoing conversations. So people coming to these talks, there's been a sort of consistent audience, but people also have been coming to particular talks. And so the PhD students were also responding to the kind of ideas and the discussions that had taken place over a number of months, really. So it was also thinking about, different ways of making connection, and also about neurodiversity and different forms of note taking and of making connection that might suit different styles of thought and memory and so on. So there were quite a lot of things that we were thinking about, and as I said, it's something that we're going to be continuing to develop, and the idea is that we will. So there are animations for a number of the talks that have been given over the last year, but we're also going to be editing together a video, probably an animation that's probably a bit shorter than this, with a voiceover that kind of in a very simple way talks about the talk series and the idea of the art research garden, in a way to kind of galvanize interest in it, but also to kind of share some of the thoughts and ideas and aspirations that have been kind of motivating us as we've been in this strange situation of separation and lack of personal presence over the last 12 months. So it really, the talk series has felt like a little bit of a lifeline in terms of connection, and in terms of also kind of international solidarity at this, in this, with Brexit and so on. It seems like a really important time to be actually building our relations with people who we want to work with all around the world. So the talk series was also, it was about a very specific site, a really small specific place, but it's also about how we can be in communication with each other respectfully, non-appropriatively, and learn from different situations. So I was talking a bit in the talk about different ideas of rewilding, and so in the UK that's tended to be very much a kind of landed gentry pursuit, involving massive estates with private property. It's very contentious and so on, but having an example like Sakia in Palestine, where there's a rewilding practice which is organized according to an entirely different logic, is really important to pay attention to. So it's also about kind of looking at these important examples and paying attention to them, and their practices that also involve a lot of like really focused attention on a wall or a well or a particular kind of plant and so on. So kind of slowing down and and in that slowing down, hopefully allowing new things to proliferate.
Great. You've touched on a number of points that I was going to ask about. I'm really interested in this idea of the garden as a counter mapping site, and particularly within the context of an educational institution and using that site as a public space. But in your presentation, you also point to the sort of tensions, the epistemological tensions. And I wonder, you've touched on it a little bit, but how does it sit formally within the university? Does it come up against the kind of cognitive hierarchies that are often embedded in curriculum or learning outcomes and this kind of thing? How does it feed back in to the formal program or the institution in a pedagogical way?
Yeah, so one of the interesting things about the allotment, which has been going on for a number of years, is it hasn't really been a sort of instrumentalized space. You know, it's very much dependent on people who stand up and come, and you know, particular artists and curators wanting to use the space to do something interesting, to run a workshop, to install a sculpture, or do some performances, or bring in someone who can teach permaculture or potato breeding. And I think that there is obviously a whole set of questions when you try to scale that up, you know, and you know, so something quite grassroots can get instrumentalized in various ways. And I suppose it's about trying to kind of really stay very focused on what the aims are, and on, you know, it's a very horizontal space, so it's for everyone. It doesn't matter if you're a lecturer or you're working in the library, or you're students, or, you know, or you live down the road and you like popping in there for the company or whatever. That's all fine. Research garden is something slightly different in that it will be there'll be moments of openness to it, but it's also be a space where, you know, artists can conduct their artistic research, and, you know, a space for rehearsal and trying things out and so on. And I mean, I think that one of the reasons why it felt important to do the talk series was really to also learn from really good examples. So, you know, New Cross, where Goldsmiths is a area which historically is very much connected to British colonialism and to the slave trade with the docks at Deptford. It's also a place where there's been intense anti-racist, anti-fascist struggle, and of course discrimination. So, you know, Goldsmiths may not think of itself as a hugely privileged institution compared to some other places, but, you know, it still is a site of, you know, resources that can appear quite substantial and quite inaccessible. So it's also sort of thinking about those kinds of things as well. So yeah, I think I find the garden to be, I find Jamaica Kincaid's writing about these sort of contradictions of the garden really, really important. So she talks about the sort of, she pays great attention to the discomforts of the garden, how it makes her feel uncomfortable, you know, awareness of how certain plants have been brought from other places, parts of the world, and propagated, and the kind of luxury and eliteness of certain garden spaces alongside her joy, right? So this is the thing, you know, how do we hold a space for all of those contradictions? And I don't think that's an easy thing to do, but it feels really important to try somehow.
Yeah, and I think you articulated that well, and in a way that moving from the cognitive to the sensual is really important for the way that the garden operates as a public or almost like a popular education device, if you like. So I might just use that as the opportunity to move over to the next presenter who will present on that very idea, the idea of sensing, of moving from mapping to sensing. And the next presenter is Stefanie Hessler. And Stefanie is a curator, a writer, and an editor. She is the director of the Kunsthal Trondheim in Norway. Her work focuses on ecologies and technology from an intersectional feminist perspective. Recent curatorial projects include Down to Earth at Gropiusbau Berliner, Jonas Moving Off the Land 2 at the Museo Nacional, Tyson Bornemissia in Madrid, and at Open Space Venice. So I'm going to just play Stefanie's presentation first and then come back in with a question, if that's okay. Okay?
That's good.
Thank you, Loughran, for inviting me to speak today. And thanks to the Dublin Technological University and Public Art Fund for hosting. Today, I want to talk about the role of sensing, affect, and feeling in art through one of the artistic projects in the upcoming 17th Momenta Biennale in Teotihuacan, Munyang, Montreal, that I'm currently curating and which is set to open on the 8th of September. Titled Sensing Nature, the Biennale concocts love potions from which we can think and feel different, more caring relations with nature. The Biennale considers environmental justice and its intersections with social justice, not only a matter of analysis and grassroots activism, but also of sensing and feeling. The exhibiting artists invite us to forge intimate kinships with non-human life worlds. They make room for stories that dwell in the blurred boundaries between technology and ancestral wisdoms. They propose to listen and observe, smell, touch, speak, to the land, to water, to air, not with the aim to distantly understand, grasp, or exploit, but to resonate, to vibrate, to feel together. At this moment of planetary urgency, many of us know that business cannot go on as usual. While the sciences are often looked to for facts and the arts for imagination, I argue that in order to make change, we need to turn our attention to sensing, to affect, and to feeling. Note that none of us sense in the same way, and our diverse and different abled bodies perceive and feel differently. The senses, as well as feelings, were long considered tangential in the West, and I use the term knowing that it's already dated today, but global north doesn't quite fit here either. Feminist care and closeness to nature are still often regarded as inferior bases of action than the cognitive and the rational. They were considered part of the private and intimate spheres, not the public sphere, although arguably this is changing today, not least in an expanded public sphere, including online spaces and social media. The sociologist Aníbal Quijano helps us see how this Eurocentric primacy of masculinized agency grounded in thought facilitates adversarial treatment of nature and colonialist structures of power. Such hierarchies based in binaries produce and naturalize racial, ethnic, anthropological, and national categories by presenting them as founded on scientific terms and objective structures. And my curatorial work often explores the question, what happens if we seek to undo hierarchies between cognitive and affective ways of knowing and being? During my research for the Momenta Biennale, I met Tuetanatsi Swiss, an artist and ethnobotanist of Squamish, Stolo, Hawaiian, and Swiss descent. For Momenta, we invited Wiss to plant a garden in Montreal together with her collaborators Silver Bear, Faye Mullen, Jocelyn Two Crows Tremblay, as well as a group of indigequeer, Two-Spirit trans community members. The project is currently being developed under the title Tion Hengwen, Supporters of Life, and in fact, CEAS is coming to Montreal next week to begin the planting process. I'm going to share my screen here for you to see some of that project. In cities such as Montreal, we usually encounter plants in gardens and parks or emerging from between the cracks in the pavement. Whereas Momenta takes place mostly indoors, far from chlorophylls and sunlight, the project by Tuetanatsi Swiss and this land-based collective is working in an outdoor public space downtown at the north side of the Grande Bibliothèque Boncu. In the gardens Wiss creates, indigenous languages and cultural elements are always present. She develops the gardens based in principles of permaculture in spaces where she sees the need to restore and remediate where indigenous plants and ecosystems previously existed. The plants are local native varieties and are carefully researched for their medicinal properties and their utilitarian and ceremonial value. The shapes in which they are embedded in are inspired by local indigenous cultural symbols. All of these elements combine to create visibility for indigenous plants, peoples, and animals that are present but have few safe places to gather and coexist in urban spaces. The garden is intended to encourage passers-by from local indigenous, Black, and other diasporic communities, as well as settler cultures, to engage with the plants within this habitat. And in the words of the artists, affirming indigenous brilliance, sovereignty, and realness, we have come together to carry forward our responsibilities to our ancestors, past, present, future. So here in this garden, a different way of relating is reintroduced to a public sphere from which indigenous ways of relating have largely been displaced. The minerals of the Earth's geology, as well as the plants, are considered by the artists as some of the eldest relatives, whereas we humans are some of the youngest ones to have arrived on Earth. And so the artists call for our independent existences to be recognized. The process of convening and sharing among humans is very important for the project. It offers a different possibility for encounter, for sensing, for considering public space, for feeling, and for building relations. It is deeply embedded in relations and it cannot be thought outside of them. In fact, a garden is not merely a garden, but the process of making it, the relations it is dependent on and which it also enables in turn, as well as the way it speaks to the senses beyond an exhibition in an enclosed space, all are integral parts to the project. The process of convening and sharing between humans and non-humans, researching the histories of native plants, creating awareness about healing and land stewardship, and the gardens themselves with plants arranged to represent indigenous symbols, all form part of the artwork which places affect and care at the core. But importantly, the project does not propose a simple, straightforward solution. And this is a crucial difference to how art is often being used in ecologically and socially engaged contexts today. This is not suggesting that gardens everywhere are going to save us from the various planetary crises, even if they can contribute to making a situated difference. But through the effective process of creating the work with our collaborators, the healing of land, as well as the aesthetic offering the gardens make, the work highlights our human entanglement with non-humans, with the land, with various temporalities of plants, of geology, of bees, as well as their uneven and unequal distribution. And I want to stress here the words of the Metis scholar Zoe Todd when she alerts us to the generalizations of such terms as humans, or indeed the concept of the Anthropocene, since it, in the words of Todd, blends the distinctions between the people, nations, and collectives who drive the fossil fuel economy and those who do not. So I believe that rather than offering solutions and running the risk of more and more problems being outsourced to the arts to solve, art's power at this moment in time lies in its ability to interfere in structures of feeling. And I borrowed a term from Raymond Williams and find it fruitful in this context as it accentuates the way feelings permeate culture. I also propose to expand the term to include structures of sensing. So structures of sensing and structures of feeling. Art can interfere in these structures and reshape what Isabelle Stengers calls a cosmopolitical web, or what the Dakota science and technology scholar Kim Tolbert refers to as being in good relation. In these relational webs, binary Western separations become untenable and give way to the multiple relations that constitute us. In art, separations are still prevalent. The modernist ideal of viewing art has been disengaged contemplation, supposing that a distant viewer can be situated outside of the relations at play in making, exhibiting, funding, selling, shipping, and preserving art. Of course, various avant-gardes have disputed various separations between art and life, but the idea that there can be separations between, for instance, an artwork and its making, its ethics, and all of its relations remains strong. In the context of ecofeminism, the scholar and activist Marty Keel has critiqued the modernist ideal of rational contemplation, showing how it imposed a hierarchical order onto the world in which nature served as a background while animals, women, and those not subscribing to so-called modernist ideals, for instance, indigenous people, were dismissed as mindless objects. I see parallels between Keel's critique of contemplation and hierarchized relations outlined by Anibal Quijano that I mentioned earlier. In the focus on contemplation and art, we see the perpetuation of ideals rooted in modernist paradigms and epistemes deriving from the Holocene. If we acknowledge the web of relations constituting us, then we need to attend to both cognitive and embodied modes of knowing. In the Anthropocene and for art in the Anthropocene, we cannot but recognize that sensing, affect, and feelings matter. In fact, carving out a space for sensing and feeling is nothing short of a political act. The work of the self-described Black feminist, lesbian, poet, mother, and warrior, Audre Lorde, notably considers the powers of the erotic as a political resource. Lorde writes, "As women, we have come to distrust their power, which rises from our deepest and non-rational knowledge." End of quote. So I suggest that we trust this power, and to be clear, I also consider the term women to be trans-inclusive, gauging it with its various intersections with race, class, gender, disability, geography, and so on. Today, I yearn to see and feel more exhibitions that go beyond the descriptive, that recognize the power of the erotic, of the affective, and that have a dance with the cognitive. In the 1960s and 90s, institutional critique and the educational turn have interfered in the structures of art and world making, to name just a few examples. So today that the Anthropocene is on the agenda of the art world, curating in this new, unevenly caused and unevenly distributed era needs to differ from curating in the Holocene and its remainders. I think that C. Swiss and her collaborators' project can be a useful model for us. It is shaped by, enabled indeed by relations, and it creates relations in turn. These relations are not limited to humans, but include affective relations with bacteria, toxins, plastics, rocks, and spirits. I feel that the most pertinent curatorial work in times of climate considers sensing, affect, and feeling as the catalyst, or if you prefer, love potion, from which we can think and feel more caring relations with humans and non-humans. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. Did you hear all that okay?
I did, yeah, but I've heard it before, so.
Okay. Yeah, so what I really liked was this connection between the gardens in the two presentations. And what it brought up for me is this notion of relation, which you really emphasize in the presentation. And I was going to attempt a curatorial question around this, which is, you mentioned institutional critique and the pedagogical turn, but what I'm wondering is, has the shift in the Anthropocene changed our understanding of relation, let's say from one that we would be used to in relational aesthetics, which was much more born out of a response to urban fragmentation, those modernist processes. So I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on how you're working with a different understanding of relation than we're used to in relational aesthetics.
I think, yeah, it's a good question. I think there's a quite significant difference actually between relational aesthetics and the kind of practice that Roz introduced and that Swiss is engaged in. And one of those big differences is the time that it takes to develop projects and the sort of engagement with certain communities. Whereas with relational aesthetics, it was very often the case that an artist would arrive at a community, do a project for a certain amount of time, and then leave. And then, there might be some longer lasting sort of conversations, or it might indeed lead to changed relations in that particular situation, but the artists would usually sort of extract themselves from that set of relations. Whereas I feel that the projects, the allotment at Goldsmiths, which has been going on for 6 years now, as well as C's Wiss's practice, who, she's been practicing permaculture and through her artistic practice for many, many years. I think there's a very different way of of relating, possibly also a different kind of motivation. And I think that the difference is too that there's not so much of a, or today, you know, the plants and animals and all sorts of other entities that form part of these relations are also seen much more as agents that really contribute to the making of these projects. And they're also credited in a different way, and their agency is somewhat, you know, given more space. Whereas I feel that previously that wasn't so much the case. But I also think that there are very different parts of the art world where these types of practices occur and where they don't occur. So I feel that in smaller kind of grassroots projects, we can actually see a change in relations, and we can see that people think much more carefully about decisions and, you know, the kind of implications that certain decisions and certain actions have. Whereas in larger institutions, I feel that that conversation is arriving very slowly, but it's also very often the sort of changes happen more at a performative kind of surface level. They don't really permeate into the structures of the institution. And I think that's going to take more time, more activist work.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. So from that, I take the two most distinctive features being duration, the time, but also this shift from thinking about the environment as the background to human relations, to the environment being agents in the idea of relationality. And so I think those are really important shifts in how we perceive the ecology of relations now, as opposed to always the human-centered urban built environment.
And there's a big difference, I think, too, between, you know, who initiates projects and who makes the rules for how the projects can play out, and whether institutions are willing and able to actually listen and to, you know, to not be so process oriented that, okay, we have an opening on that day, we need to get the project done, and it's all about a final presentation, but to actually be open to processes, be open to truly engage in a conversation and to truly allow themselves to be affected and to be changed through that process.
Great. Thank you very much. We'll come back to some of those points after we have Alex. So I'm just going to close out here. Alex, are you there?
Yep.
Great. So Alex is going to present from his own side. He's going to play his own video, but I'll just give a little bit of an introduction to his work before we kick off. So Alex is a sound artist, media designer, and educator who maintains a practice exploring issues of sustainability at the intersection of art and science. He has been an artist in residence in an Australian mountain village on an Iowa farm, at a Midwestern biological field research station, and on Isle Royale National Park. He is currently director of the Artist in Residence program at Iowa Lakeside Lab and associate professor at Iowa State University. Over to you, Alex.
All right, thanks so much, Glenn. Let me start my sharing here. Share sound. Hey everyone, thank you so much for attending this conference and this panel. I'm really excited to talk about my work as a sound artist. Thank you so much also to the organizers for bringing this all together. I'm really looking forward to sharing the work that I've made, but also the conversation in the Q&A session to follow. So my name is Alex Braidwood, and you can learn more about my work beyond this presentation at my website, which is listeninginstruments.com. And if you want to find out more about what I'm up to, you can follow me on Instagram at Listening Instruments. So I'm going to talk today about aspects of my arts practice that involve the public. Now, sometimes that's work that's intentionally created to be in public, and sometimes that's work that's created along with the public. So I want to start out with how I got interested in this space, and it really began with this project known that I call the Noisilation Headphones. And the idea here is that I was very curious about this critical intervention of people and their soundscapes. And I came up with this term anti-cancellation, partially because as I watched people engage in various soundscapes with their mobile devices and their headphones, I quickly realized that we are really good at blocking out sound with noise canceling headphones. We're also really good at covering it up by creating like louder sounds through those headphones. We're also really good at dividing ourselves from it with our cars and our homes and things like that. And this disconnect from our soundscape, I think, has left us in a problematic space. And so we'll get kind of more into this as the presentation goes along. But a lot of this has to do with specifically tackling the fact that we live in a visually dominant culture, and we're really just in the beginning stages of figuring out how important the soundscape is to not only us, but the natural environment. So I was curious about this space between the listener and the sounds that they're trying to avoid, and wondering how could I interrogate that as an artist. So I came up with this project called the Noisilation Headphones, did a bunch of prototypes, and ended up developing this system, which exists in a gallery. And the idea here is that these tubes have motors, solenoids mounted on the side of them. They're a linear actuator that when they're hit with electricity, they contract. And so it pulls down and it opens up this custom valves that I've mounted on the top of the tubes. And what that does is that allows for more or less sound to come in. And then it also changes the resonant frequencies of the sounds as they sort of reverberate through the pipes. And I was able to take this around and do a bunch of different kinds of workshops and different installations in some really interesting places around the world, and give people this opportunity to explore what were otherwise familiar spaces, but through this acoustic investigation. And that then developed into a series of workshops, which I'm still evolving and I'm still doing, that I call the Listening Instruments Invention workshops. And essentially that's a kit of parts that I bring in and work with different people in different age groups, all ages really, in order to put together these different listening instruments and interrogate and investigate the spaces that they might be pretty familiar with. This particular one was a public workshop that I did with a group called Side Street Projects in LA. And this was one of the first ones that I did where people from the community could just sort of come by on a Saturday afternoon and develop these things. And so I've done them with a variety of different groups and had a variety of different activities. It's kind of a critical investigation. It's also a design build type activity, but really the goal is to allow people to put them on and experience the soundscapes around them in ways that they weren't necessarily expecting. So another project that I did is much more of a traditional sort of public interactive art project, and it's called the Water Quality Xylophone. And what this is it's an interactive musical instrument that I created based on data, water quality data, collected from a river nearby. So as you can see from this photograph, it's installed next to an activity path where cyclists and skateboarders and rollerbladers and joggers frequent. And right on the other side of that tree, that line of trees, there's a river. And so the way in which I determined the length of the pipes is driven by water quality readings that were taken quarterly over the previous year from that river. So here's a little video that explains how that worked. I am building what I'm calling a water quality xylophone. My work as a sound artist really focuses on connecting people to the sounds that are in their environment. As we build communities, as we build public spaces, sound is a really important part of that. And the definition of what happens in those spaces and even how people engage with each other in those spaces can really be identified when you start looking at and investigating the sound. I think public art is very important. I think art is important. I think art has a way of representing culture. I think it has a way of connecting people to different parts of themselves. I think it has a way of connecting different people to different parts of their community. And the idea of making public art is a really great opportunity to engage people where they are. Using data that was collected from Jordan Creek, which is just right over there, I created this interactive musical instrument so that people could play the data for the different readings of E. coli and chloride that have been collected quarterly over the past year. Here you can see on the 4 pipes that represent E. coli, this is the acceptable level of E. coli. What the instrument tells you then is that the E. coli level was always above the acceptable level. And in this case, during this collection period, the E. coli level was over 4 times the acceptable amount, making the longest pipe in the instrument. That also led to a project which is a organization that I created called the Bureau of Infrastructure Tourism. So this is the logo that I developed for it. The idea being that Infrastructure is something that we often overlook or only pay attention to when it's causing problems. And so the idea with this was that I created listening tours of particular environments, and I've done these in a couple of different cities. And the idea is then that we get together and we tour places that are overlooked, places that are non-places, places that were potentially designed for us even not to be there in some ways, as a way to investigate how we relate to our built environment and some of the issues related to that. So the tours for this particular event had very specific times. There's a van with like the signage. I do a little bit of an introduction before the tour starts. And then we go to these places and we spend time in them. You can see there's also this component of the listening instruments that goes along with it, again, as a way to change the relationship to something that might already be familiar, just as a way to bring more attention to it. I also design activity books that go along with it. So then in the van, there are activities to do along the way. There's also a list of resources and things like that. And so it's a way of experimenting and exploring a number of different acoustic environments within places where people are. These are the neighborhoods that people live in. And this idea of having like little things that people come across was something that I had started with this project called Listen Right Here, which began as a series of stickers. And I designed these stickers which say official sonic survey point, do not disturb, listenrighthere.com. And then they have like a kind of a code that I've invented. And the idea with this is, my hope is that people will see this and they will stop and wonder, what is being observed here? What is being documented? What about this sonic environment is being recorded? Just as a way to get folks to stop and listen wherever they might be. And that's a big thrust. And so when I had a chance to do a project with the Des Moines Arts Center, so Des Moines is the capital city of Iowa here in the US, and the Des Moines Arts Center is the biggest arts organization in the state. And I had a chance to be the Iowa artist for one of these years. So what I did for that year was I designed and built solar-powered sound recorders and installed them around the city in a variety of spaces, along with these signs that told people what the project was about. Again, to try to get people to pay attention and listen to their different environments. So they were installed in a variety of different locations, and they collected sound over the course of a 6-week period. And the locations were infrastructure-based, they were cultural-based. And then while they were up, I also organized public tours. So we took a school bus and we drove around to the different locations to talk about what was happening in those environments. What was the soundscape? What were the noise concerns? Again, there's a workbook that goes along with it. It had some activities, it had additional resources to follow up. And then I took those recordings and I created a composition out of them by going through, organizing the files, installing a multi-speaker system. The way the sounds played back, it was different every single time somebody came into it. There was no loop, there was no beginning and no end. And essentially what it did was it created a new place within that gallery space. And it really brought about this idea that I think is really important, which is to change people's relationship to something that they find familiar by creating something that's differently familiar. So it's something that they've known, they know it's there, it's a city they live in, it's a city they've been through, but there's something different when those sounds are all contracted into one single place. And it really allows us to have these discussions about the importance of acoustic ecology, the importance of noise abatement, and what the design implications of those kind of things are. So during the winter, I was very interested in how I could continue to engage people with nature sound, even though where I live, it was winter, it was cold. Again, we're in the middle of the pandemic. People felt like they were locked in their houses. And so I wanted to figure out, okay, I have been fortunate to go around the world and collect up all these nature sound recordings. My favorite thing to record is the dawn chorus, which happens first thing in the day. How do I expose these sounds in a way that more people can access them? So that's when I came up with this idea of a live performance, and I called it Sunday Mass. Mass stands for a mechanism for actualizing speculative soundscapes. And what I did was every week I would create a new series of nature sound explorations. Some of them were sort of rhythmic and they were more ambient at times. And the whole idea was that I built the structure for the 1-hour performance on the energy level of the dawn chorus. So the dawn chorus starts a few minutes before the sun comes up. It starts to become active as the first light happens. During sunrise, it's incredibly active, and then it kind of settles into the day. So I used this as a model to develop compositions that I would then perform every Sunday live at 5 o'clock local time where I'm at in Central Time in the US. And I streamed it over YouTube and Twitch and Mixcloud, just as a way to provide some kind of like calm, central space for people to be able to experience nature sound wherever they were. And my sort of tagline for it was that I wanted to bring a little bit of outdoors to your indoors. And so again, it was cold. It was hard to get outside. It was hard to be around people. So I did a whole series of these. And they're still up on YouTube if you're interested in checking them out. And you can find more of those links at my link tree, which is Listening Instruments. And so I closed every one of those performances with a small reminder, which I would like to offer to you again today, which is that I hope you'll take a minute to pause and listen to your surroundings wherever you might be. I think it's really one of the most important things we could do, not only to stay present, but also as we make design decisions about our built environment, to really pay attention to the noise that we're putting out into the world. So thank you very much for listening. Again, my name is Alex Braidwood. My website is listeninginstruments.com, and you can find me on Instagram, SoundCloud, Mixcloud as Listening Instruments. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Alex.
Yeah, thank you. Hopefully that all came through okay.
Yep, that was absolutely great. Very meta at one point, where we had a number of different videos going at the same time. You were just repeating into the background. But yeah, look, very interesting work. And what I would really like to focus on, just coming off from Stefanie's presentation, is the emphasis on listening and acoustics. And you touched on it very briefly at the beginning of your presentation, where you mentioned the visual. And in many ways, this shift towards the Anthropocene has prompted a move away from the visual towards the acoustic, certainly within the visual arts in a way, really kind of unprecedented way. Sounding is becoming a very, very common art form. So I wonder if you could just speak a little bit to that in terms of the politics of listening and acoustic aesthetics, but also how you use that to, in a way, hack the city in a different way than we're used to.
Yeah, so to start with, the sort of the politics or the impact of listening, the thing that I think is the most one of the most important things to consider about it is that our listening is something that we don't have a lot of control over. Our hearing, our ears, they're working all of the time. We hear in, if we're hearing beings, if our ears are functioning, we hear in 360 degrees, all the way around us all the time. Our ears are functioning when we sleep. Whereas like visually, we have a bit more control. We can close our eyes, we can look away, things like that. So there's a level of impact with our hearing and listening, which gets to us in a different way. And so when we're in an urban environment, or even when we're in a natural environment, the ways in which we engage with that space becomes dictated quite often by our perception and our expectation. So when we go into an urban environment, we sort of move into a space where what is called the cocktail effect takes over, the cocktail party effect, takes over, where we have some level of control within our mind of what we focus on. However, we don't have the ability to, as John Cage always said, our ears don't blink. So that level of control, that level of invasion can at times become quite violent. It can become quite a violation of our personal space. And so my interest in that, and the idea of focusing on listening, is much more about having a different set of indicators for how things are going, but also as a designer, to bring it into the forefront of consideration when we are thinking about what we're adding into a particular location, when we're choosing building materials, when we're thinking about site planning, things like that. And that's part of why the dawn chorus is so interesting to me, because the dawn chorus in a particular, wilderness environment or a space with a different level of protection can be used as a marker for how much human noise has impacted that space. So sort of the cleaner a dawn chorus is, the healthier that environment. Oftentimes, you can know that it's a healthier environment. So those are the things that I think are the most sort of interesting and valuable about that. And as the interest in this picks up, I get really excited about what that means for how we move through these spaces and how we sort of share these experiences.
Yeah, it's very similar, I suppose, to what we were talking about previously, where it's about bringing what would have been a background environment into the foreground in a way that we're not used to, possibly due to the separation between humans and nature through modernity, and in particular with the privileging of the visual on that. I'm going to take a step back from the one-on-ones and invite the other speakers to come in now, Alex. And great. So can we just go to, yeah, okay, lovely. So I know I've sent you all on 3 sort of questions to think about. But before we get to that, I just want to open it up to you yourselves to see if you would like to, if you have any questions for each other, because for me, there are so many intersecting lines that I thought it would be helpful just to throw it open to you really quickly, just to see, there's been 3 presentations, and I think it's worth giving you that opportunity. So just put your hand up. Yay! Okay, Ross, over to you, Ross.
I mean, I think such rich presentations. Thank you so much, Alex and Stefanie. I'm kind of really want to listen over to the recordings again, because there was just so much to take in. And I'm just really struck by lots of things, but sort of partly because we've just been hearing from Alex, just thinking about your work with making infrastructures noticeable, which we might otherwise take for granted, and thinking about sound, which tends to be can be quite an overlooked sense in comparison to the visual, perhaps. We live in a very sort of visual, hyper-visual culture. And I suppose the way that resonates for me particularly is in thinking about my own work is about soil and soil as infrastructure, and how that involves a kind of shift that's also aesthetic as well as ethical and political and practical, in terms of thinking about how we might appreciate soil as an infrastructure that keeps us alive, right? And I remember giving a talk where I was waxing lyrical about soil, and someone asked me a question and said, like, if you think about the blue marble moment and how the sort of planetary and the cosmic has this incredible aesthetic power, the earth is kind of a hard sell. And what I would say to that always is, you can only say that if you haven't turned a compost heap. And when we do that every year at the allotment with a group of students and staff coming together, what you have is this incredibly intense aesthetic experience, which is also very, very sensory, right? So thinking here about Stefanie's point about sort of multiple sensorium, and how the soil that gets produced by a compost heap after a year has this beautiful fragrance and texture, and you want to run your finger through it and so on. So I guess it's also about this sort of shift that's also aesthetic as well as political and ethical and so on, and that's embodied as well, I guess. So that wasn't really a question, it was more of a kind of reflection or prompt.
Okay, Stefanie, do you want to follow on from that?
Yeah, I really like this idea of the aesthetic, the different aesthetic experience, because in the end, this is what art is doing as well. And I feel also, what Alex is doing, you're trying to attune us to engaging in a different way with our surroundings, and of which we form a part. So to really show how we're embedded in our milieu or environment, or however you want to call it, Umwelt, and to shift our attention towards that aesthetic experience. I actually had a question for Roz. I would love to hear more about one of the little text bits that popped up in the beautiful animation, which, by the way, I love, that looked like living organs in a body, or like root systems, mycelium underground. It was really, really beautiful. And I like the non-linearity of it as well, and how things sort of coexisted at the same time. And there was one bit that popped up which said exquisite subsistence. And I would just love to hear, I love the way that it sounds, and I just love to hear more also about the exquisite and the subsistence part and the pairing, and if this is a term you've been working with explicitly in the project.
Yeah, so this was brought into this conversation by Morag, who's an artist who's doing a PhD. I'm supervising her PhD, so she's doing her PhD at Goldsmiths, but she's based in Wales, and a lot of her work is about thinking about a lot of concepts from Raven Williams, actually, in relation to rural life and the history of Wales, and her personal background, family background, which is very much embedded in ecology as well as art making. So exquisite subsistence is a phrase that comes from Kristen Ross's wonderful book, Communal Luxury, which is a book which was incredibly powerful for me, for making me realize that the Paris Commune was a moment of internationalism, but also kind of proto-ecology in terms of, its ambitions and so on. And Morag was very interested in the walled gardens in Paris and how they formed a kind of barrier, a protective barrier around the commune, but also how they enabled the nurturing of certain kinds of plants, and particularly apricots. So one of the things that she would like to do is plant an apricot tree in the art research garden. And so we were thinking about questions of abundance and scarcity. We're in this moment of obscene precarity and fragility. There are food banks in widespread use in the UK and so on, and ways in which perhaps we can find abundance through, mutual aid and so on. But it was also about there was a very interesting discussion around how you might share something, and maybe that's through smell. Maybe you're walking along the street and you get a scent of apricot, or elderflower or something like that, and maybe that exquisiteness it might be something that you taste, but it might be also something that's shared in this sort of very ephemeral way. So I think there's sort of I really like the Robin Wall Kimmerer's way of talking about abundance and about the garden as a space of care and nurturing and love, actually, and that the love that plants show us, perhaps we can talk of it in that way when they blossom. They're blossoming for bees, but they're also blossoming for us, because we then choose to propagate them and so on. So can we talk about love in that way? Perhaps we can, if we use our imaginations. So I also really love this finding the preciousness in things. Seems to be something that artists are very good at helping us with.
Great. Just to bring us back then to this idea of the public and how we engage with that and engage with environmental issues. I was really struck by this presentation by Stefanie of feelings as almost a kind of public dissensus. And I wonder if, in many ways, you've all touched on the positive aspects of engaging with these issues in public space, but are there any negative aspects? Are there any disadvantages to developing this kind of work in public spaces, or challenges that we need to think about in terms of where we are presently? Alex, I might start that off with you.
Yeah, I think a couple of the big challenges with the framing of public art is sometimes a very limited idea of what public art tends to be, especially when you think about like supporters and funders and in communities and the things people are willing to invest in. The other thing that I think sometimes becomes a bit of a problem is length of engagement. So there are often times where, you know, as I mentioned sort of in that video, one of the powers of public art is it can meet people where they are. One of the drawbacks of that is that it sometimes can be discovered unexpectedly, and it can be discovered almost passively and in passing. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity there for exploring how to draw people into that kind of work, how to build on the types of engagements that are happening. That's what I think is powerful about things that both Ross and Stefanie talked about. The idea of bringing people into a space with activities, with learning, with levels of engagement. And I think that pushes the idea of public art into some new places that communities may initially wrestle with in terms of how they exist, how long do they exist, how durable are they, you know, monitored in different ways. Those are all, I think, some of the areas that could become difficult.
Great. Ross?
Yeah, no, I mean, I suppose I completely agree with what Alex said around these are really kind of important questions. I was also thinking about this question of maintenance, and this has to do with the sort of time of engagement, you know, and that always seems to be a really crucial question, you know, who's going to tidy up? And that seems to be a really important environmental question. And Françoise Vergès has been writing really important things about this recently in terms of, you know, a broader question of who's going to tidy up the big mess we're making of the environment, right? So, yeah, and certain populations and demographics that end up doing that and tidying up an awful lot. So I also think that sort of scaling back to making art in public spaces, or there being sometimes a sort of certain expectation that you just need to sort of set something up and let it run. Well, no, that tends not to work very well. So having a plan for maintenance seems really important, and thinking about who's going to do the work. And I mean, this also relates to the point I was earlier making about soil. You know, if we understand soil in the way that Maria Puig de la Bella Casa talks about it as all of our remains, right? So what do we want our remains to do? Where do we want them to go? And I think the same applies for art making as well.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. It's what I had in mind when you were talking about the garden and Goldsmiths, is how does that institution, how does its infrastructure support the sustainability of the garden itself? But we only have a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to give the last word over to Stefanie, if you would like to respond to that question around what might be the challenges of environmental art in public spaces at this time.
Yeah, well, maybe to add to what Ross is saying in terms of maintenance, and you bring up Maria Puig de la Bella Casa and the question of care. So I feel that also to consider the sort of labor that has been performed by feminized people, you know, and how to think about care, not as an individual kind of idea about, you know, self-care, but about a collective mode. And then I think also the question is, you know, who initiates these kinds of projects and why are they there, you know? So is it the city who decides that, okay, it would look really good for us to have a garden, community garden here? Or is it aligned with the needs of communities, or, you know, are communities brought in, and who gets to decide? Because there's a lot of appropriation happening as well, especially when it comes to, you know, I mean, and different ways of gardening or of relating. We talk a lot about relations, but of course, that's also, I think it's important to acknowledge where these forms of thinking actually come from, right? Yeah, so I think one of the challenges, and where I hope that we will see some really exciting new, you know, exciting projects and new ways of doing, is really to take into consideration all of the nuance and complexities, and think away from a public art project as a sort of final project, as a product, whether that's a bronze sculpture or, you know, a garden, but to think about it as something completely different, as a process that's way more complex and requires a lot of different participants, to both human and non-human, to be part of it.
Great. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I could continue this on for another hour easily. and hopefully you guys will find some way to connect afterwards, given the common interest that you have. Thank you all very much for the time you put into your presentations and your considered response to the questions. Take care and hopefully talk soon.
Thanks so much, Glenn, Ross, Stephanie.
Thank you.
It's good to see you.
Thank you.